Welcome to Magnificast. This is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, and this week it's also about two guys trying not to cough into their microphones. That's right, this is the special We're Really Sick edition of the Magnificast.
November 1, what up? 500 years of Reformation, we still couldn't get past the common cold.
Yeah, that's right. And it made us sick. Oh, no. Well, anyways, I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are, as usual, media archaeology, cultural theory, and very much Christianity and leftist politics.
I'm Dean. I'm a Catholic PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and I research all kinds of things. I write as a journalist, and let's see, what else am I doing this week? My cat also got sick. One of my cats. That is a new research interest, trying to figure out why your cat winks all the time.
No, is that real? Is that what your cat does?
Yeah, just winking at me all the time. And we took him to the vet for a very expensive bill. It turns out cats do not have socialized medicine here in Canada yet. But he's sick. So now we got to put this gunk in his eye 2 times a day. He's not happy about that. Neither are we.
No. Wow. What a tale. What a story.
Yeah, I know. So that's my research interest this week. Cat winks.
Cat winks. At least it's kind of cute, though.
It is actually very cute, and he's extremely forgiving. Basically, we just traumatize him 2 times a day, and then he's like, can someone please, hold me still, though? That would be fine. It's that's better than the alternative. That's
some good stuff. Hey, do Canadians celebrate Halloween? Do you guys Halloween up there?
Yeah, we do. We do celebrate it. I live in an apartment complex, and nobody ever knocks on our door. But at the comic book shop where I work, they get Halloween comic books, and kids come in costumed up. It's pretty good.
That's awesome. That's good. Good job, Canada. So we took Lewis trick or treating this week, and they have this thing in Greenville where there's a trunk or treat, and all of the local businesses and churches will meet on the square and give you candy from the back of a car. It sounds sketchy, nice. But it's good. One of the churches in town was there. I mean, all of the churches were there, but there's one in particular that did not hand out candy, but handed out cross necklaces.
Mm-hmm.
Dude, I was losing it. That's not okay. You can't.
What did Lewis think about it?
He just put it in his bag and said thanks, and because he's too polite. Also because he doesn't understand the expectation of candy yet. But listen, churches, you can't do that. This is my public putting you on blast. You cannot just hand out whatever you want at Halloween. You have to hand out candy. It's the law.
Or you have to hand out the most terrifying Chick Tracts.
One of the two. No necklaces unless they're edible. Unless they're edible necklaces, but maybe keep those to yourself.
This week we are not talking about Halloween, though. We should have probably made an episode about the Reformation or something, but also we didn't. Instead, we decided to talk about Cuba. We were just too excited after we talked to George last week about Venezuela. We were like, what other socialist states in Latin America can we dig up? So we checked out Cuba this week.
We're specifically talking about a book called Fidel and Religion, Conversations with Frei Betto on Marxism and Liberation Theology. It's kind of a big deal book. I didn't really know it until Dean directed my attention to it, but we read it, and there's lots of really interesting and good stuff in there about leftism and Christianity and Cuban Marxism and Christianity. So we're going to just kind of talk through some of that. But before we even do that, the world has provided us a very nice segue into this conversation. There's some big Cuban news today. Dean, what happened?
Yeah, so the UN, I don't know if you've heard of it, the United Nations. Turns out they are not fully united all the time. This is just one more example. So there was a vote today about, we're recording this obviously not on Friday, everyone, surprise. We lifting back the veil here a little bit. But today, November 1st, there was a vote at the UN, and it was about the U.S. Lifting an embargo blockade on Cuba that they've had for over half a century, and it has not been good for Cubans. And 191 countries said they should do it at the UN. They should lift that blockade. And 2 countries said that they should not, the United States and Israel. So that's
what an incredibly spiteful vote.
It is the most spiteful vote.
Going into this, they knew that was what it was going to be. The United States and Israel knew that was what their vote was going to be, and so did everyone else. And they're just well, I guess we're going to do it anyways, and here you go. It's such a stupid political theater. People's actual lives and material realities could be bettered by taking that embargo down, but guess not.
Yeah, I especially love that the United States doesn't even try to make an appeal or make a case or show up and lobby for other votes, because it knows that it actually doesn't have a leg to stand on. It's just listen, we hate them. What do we get about that world? We don't like them.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a lot of articles you could probably go read about this today and in the coming days. After I say this, I'm sure a better article will even be written. But in Teleser, my preferred news source, I guess, at this moment in time, Teleser has a great article about it that kind of outlines some of the theatrics of the situation. Let me read this a little bit here because it's pretty interesting, I think. So the continuation of the embargo is largely on the grounds that Cuba has a questionable human rights record, and I guess that's probably true. But this is some of the back and forth today that I really appreciate. Okay, so the article says, Cuba's foreign minister Bruno Rodriguez approached the podium to an abundance of applause. He responded to U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley's comments by stating that the United States has no moral ground to stand on in its condemnation of the Caribbean island due to its flagrant violation of human rights, citing the arrest and deportation of minors and undocumented immigrants, the killing of African Americans by U.S. police, the lack of guarantees for education and health care and restrictions on union organizing, and the refusal of U.S. companies to sell life-saving medical supplies to Cuban healthcare services. All right. So, Cuba is a country that's not perfect, but they get villainized in this really intense way. And what I appreciate, I think, about this statement is that maybe there's another narrative that we might pay attention here to. There are other violations of human rights going on in other countries that we don't pay attention to because of a increasingly hard to ignore liberal double standard.
Nobody's calling for a blockade against the United States using the same logic that the U.S. uses to punish other countries. In Cuba, it's an obvious case of human rights violations, but on the part of the U.S., they don't have a ground there. But it's also weird, they were thinking about threatening to sanction Russia over meddling in elections, allegedly, or whatever. And if every country that had ever had the U.S. meddle in their elections, put an embargo against them, it would be pretty big.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Okay, so Cuba's story isn't exceptional in the grand scheme of Caribbean islands and colonization. It's pretty comparable to a lot of other places. The indigenous people that were occupying the island were colonized by the Spanish in the 15th century. Just kind of like Puerto Rico or other places. Cuba operated as a Spanish colony until the Spanish-American War. That's a war that we like to forget happened. But when it did, Cuba gained a little bit of independence, was still basically beholden to the United States. However, with that little bit of getting better, things also got overwhelmingly worse when a cruel dictator with the last name Batista ruled over the island until he was ousted by 1959. In 1959 by Fidel and all of those good revolutionary boys and the 26th of July movement. Yeah, of course, all of them. All of them are in there. It's Cuba's noteworthy today, I think, because it's I think, to my knowledge at least, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's one of the few remaining Marxist-Leninist states. There's an overwhelming amount of negative propaganda about Cuba. We talked about some of that a few seconds ago about just, I don't know, the United States can trash them because they don't like them or whatever. It's certainly true that Cuba is not a perfect country, and there's nothing wrong noting the government repression because that's real and we should pay attention. Human rights organizations have made that all public knowledge, and you can look it up elsewhere. However, we should take these things into context a little bit. Despite all of that U.S. propaganda, life in Cuba doesn't actually seem so bad all the time for regular people. The Human Development Index, which is, definitely a liberal statistical tool, but interesting nonetheless. It notes like some analyses on life expectancy, education, income of individuals and countries. It lists Cuba at number 8 in North America, so that's kind of interesting. We get some statistical data that's like a little bit different than the sort of propaganda stories that we hear over and over again. Cuba is also known for its access to healthcare and education. Has an incredibly high and probably too high, actually, literacy rate. They say that like 99% of people are literate, and I don't know if that's actually possible, but I don't know. That's what they say.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. The most interesting thing that I learned about Cuba, kind of doing a little bit of research here, is that in 2006, Cuba was the only country that the World Wildlife Federation said met like sustainability standards as a country like developing. So that's pretty neat.
That is pretty neat.
So I don't know. The only reason I'm saying these things is that like there's all this kind of like negative propaganda that we usually just use to like other an entire like island of people, but I think that that is wrong to do.
Yeah, I think it's especially important for Americans to do some double takes when it comes to Cuba. When I moved to Canada, it was funny. I was talking to a professor just in passing, casually, and he was talking about the last vacation he and his family took, and they had gone to Cuba. And I said, "Whoa, that's pretty weird." And he's like, "Not really. Like, people go to Cuba." He was like, "It's a lot cheaper than going to Florida. I don't know. Is that what you guys do?" And I was like, "Yeah, we like when I grew up, we went to Disney World sometimes and stuff." And he was like, "No, we go to Cuba. It's really fun. It's like a cool place to be. And also there are no Americans there, which is pretty cool too." And like Emily was talking one time. Emily's my partner. She's a nanny. About how like she would see all these kids at school wearing like Cuba hats and like Cuba t-shirts and stuff. Like it was just a regular place that people went. And for me, that was just like a very weird thing because I mean, I couldn't imagine, like I literally couldn't go to Cuba when I first moved here. Actually, that hadn't like panned out yet. So
right.
It's a pretty weird thing.
Yeah, that is weird. Hopefully someday we can like actually go.
Yeah.
As American citizens.
You just have to become entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I suppose that's about it, right? Cool. That's like some introductory material, I guess, on Cuba. I don't know if you are not familiar with Cuba as a country, you should go check some stuff out. Do some year-end research. I think that's worth it. Like Dean said, it's like important for Americans to do that kind of double take because we have a history of getting it wrong and getting it wrong for some pretty divisive political reasons. So check it out. But anyways, we're going to talk about this book called Fidel and Religion. Dean, do you want to talk about why it's important and like interesting?
Yeah. So Fidel and Religion is a cool book. It is an edited transcription of interviews done between Frei Betto, who's a Dominican priest from Brazil, and he is a very amazing person in his own right. He worked with Paulo Freire, who's a radical educational theorist, to teach peasants how to read and advocate for themselves, and has done a lot of really interesting work. But he went to Cuba and had these conversations with Fidel. He talks about it in the introduction, like kind of how it all came together. But it's a really fascinating exchange because Fidel comes out in the interview as, very open to religious people, and he admits there's mistakes in Cuba on the part of how the revolutionary government has handled the church, and then also provides, I think, some very important challenges to Christian people and to Christian movements in general, trying to understand, for example, why Marxism has been anti-religious in many cases, trying to understand how Christians can actually help contribute to liberation movements. And the book really made a huge difference. It was a bestseller in Latin America. It was a pretty huge deal. It made some waves in Cuba itself. In fact, after it was published a little while later, the Communist Party of Cuba opened up its membership for Christians to join, which was previously not possible. And also, Frei Betto, after publishing this book, traveled around to other communist states, most notably the USSR, to talk to those governments about religion. So it's like a pretty formative moment in time for relationships between leftists and Christians.
Cool. So the book opens up with Frei Betto just like kind of hanging out with this journalist, and there's like lots of interesting sort of background information about Cuba going on. This conversation, it's largely a transcription of this conversation between a journalist and Fidel, But after that kind of first part of the book is over, it's interesting enough. It's a good way to kind of like get yourself familiar with Cuba itself. But after that part is over, Frei Betto starts just kind of like getting Fidel to open up about his childhood and Christianity, and like how that kind of like played a role in the pre-revolutionary Cuba. It's pretty interesting. I mean, just to hear like what it's like through sort of like Fidel's stories, you can kind of figure out what it's like what the sort of Christian culture was in Cuba, and it's pretty striking, I guess. So Dean and I do a little bit of fact checking here, but kind of came up with some conclusions that Fidel was telling the truth. So maybe the most important, the important thing, I don't know, the most important thing to kind of start off with is that like in the rural spots in Cuba, they were like not really churches. So that's pretty bizarre. Like not, I guess, what one would expect. There just weren't very many countryside churches. There weren't many priests that visited the countryside. The way that Fidel paints the picture is that Catholicism specifically, but like Protestants too, were largely an urban, a staple of urban life, and were an incredibly like bourgeois type of faith, which is not surprising in sort of like the pre-revolutionary period in Cuba. That I guess makes sense to me.
But it is unique in terms of Latin America because you get the impression that Catholicism isn't as kind of thickly ingrained across all classes as it is in many other parts of Latin America.
Yeah, that's right. It's also, so I mean, we did some double checking, and like that is actually a really true thing. It's not just Fidel's observation, but Cuba had like the least priests of most of the South American countries, so that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think that context is actually really helpful anyway for Fidel to make those observations, because it plays into a lot of interesting questions that Frei Betto will end up asking. Like, by this time that they've done the interview, this is in the mid-'80s, Nicaragua, for example, has already had its revolution, which is a very thickly Christian socialist revolution. In Chile, there were loads and loads of Christians who supported the socialist movements there, and Fidel is aware of all of them, whereas in Cuba, when he was, becoming a revolutionary, the church just wasn't really part of life in the same sort of way. And I think it just brings up a lot of interesting angles on what is going on with Catholicism in Cuba and how it did and didn't help class struggles there.
Yeah. Here's a good quote from the book that kind of elaborates on what we're saying here. So this is from Fidel. He says, all those Jesuits were rightists. Some were obviously kind people who expressed solidarity with others. They were exemplary in many ways, but ideologically they were right-wing pro-Franco reactionaries. There was no one left-wing Jesuit in Cuba at that time. So it gives you kind of an idea of like the character of Christianity in Cuba pre-revolution.
Yeah, and those are the Jesuits that educated Fidel. He went to a Jesuit school. So leading up to the revolution, and especially deposing Batista and then setting up what ended up being a Marxist-Leninist state, the revolution wasn't Marxist-Leninist at first, by the way. It's kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, leading up to it, Catholics didn't really form like a huge contingent of supporters necessarily. And that's why Fidel, I guess, didn't really seem that interested in, talking about it openly before. But what I think is so cool about this book is that he continued to follow what Christians were doing around the continent in Latin America, and also tried to cultivate relationships with the church afterwards in complicated sorts of ways. And I think that's really the value of this book, actually, is kind of getting a window into not just the history behind, church relationships in Cuba or whatever, but more getting a window into what someone like Fidel Castro, who's a very important, influential Marxist leader, actually thinks about revolution and Christianity and the potentials for confluences there.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting that that like hard atheism that you expect from, I don't know, Marxist-Leninist leaders does not come through at all, right? Like, I guess like one observation we can kind of draw from this episode, from the one with Dinner with Jonathan a few weeks ago, is just like that relationship between religion and communism is actually pretty complicated in some ways, and also not complicated at all in other ways. that there's like never actually an objection to theism as like sort of a metaphysical ideology, and more just always objections to like the political power that churches have.
Yeah, that's right. I remember there was some stuff in the Lenin essays that we read a while back with Derek Ford about religion, where Lenin basically says it doesn't really matter what people think is going to happen to them after they die. We don't care about that in the revolution. It just matters that like we got to figure this out right now. The material problems of production have to get solved, and you can believe whatever you want about like your soul. And Fidel kind of echoes something like that in this book. Like he talks about how confrontations between religion and revolutionary movements mostly stem from actual material conditions. Religion can be used by imperialism to basically poison regular people against revolutionary movements, and vice versa. Revolution, rightly, I think, in a lot of cases, views religion as a threat in those cases because it is being a threat. And I think what's very fascinating is both Fidel and Lenin and others are at least capable of separating out the possibility that religion doesn't have to be, totally opposed to revolutionary movements or parties or people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, skipping ahead just like a little bit. Frei Betto and Fidel, they talk through Fidel's childhood, and they spend a lot of time talking about like what the religious schools were like and like what Jesuit training was like. Frei Betto is really interested just to hear about like how Catholic culture kind of played out in pre-revolutionary Cuba, and that's all pretty interesting. Or like whatever. But I think the more interesting and relevant stuff kind of comes post-revolution, so maybe we can kind of jump into talking about that. So I don't really want to lay out like like the timeline of the revolution or like the 26th of July movement. You guys can just go read about it somewhere else. Go look up the Party for Socialism and Liberation has a really good liberation school kind of bit about the Cuban Revolution, so go check it out. There are people who are trustworthy to tell you about the revolution for sure. So there's this bit in the book called The Catholic Church and Revolution, and Fidel kind of talks a little bit about like what happened after the revolution and like kind of where some of the tensions with Christianity kind of came up in the Cuban Revolution. This is what Fidel says, kind of framing the larger situation. So after the revolution, it may be said that Batista's toppling was welcomed with joy by every social group without exception, including the elements that had been committed to Batista's regime. The people who had grown wealthy through dishonest means, who had stolen, and some sectors of the upper bourgeoisie that had been closely associated with Batista's regime, at least 95% of the population, several polls were taken at the time, they were glad to hear the news. Okay, so people were psyched. People were very into the revolution. It's hard not to be, honestly. I mean, revolutions,
yeah,
they are exciting.
And dictators are not great.
Yeah, I know, right? Like it seems pretty easy to get excited about the toppling of a dictator. Love it. Love when that happens. But however, the difficulties all began with the first revolutionary laws. So this is kind of interesting to me, I think, specifically as like a Christian educator, someone who works at a Christian school. It's a little bit tense. So some of the first executive laws are about like the reappropriation of land, away from the ruling elites, the bourgeoisie that were holding them previously. But the more troubling part, where things got a little more hairy, even more hairy than the reappropriation of property, was with the problem of schools, and the problem specifically of Catholic schools. So something that's always been central to Marxist-Leninists, I think just leftists in general, is the accessibility and universality of education. That's a super important tenet of like basically every leftist ideology. I mean, even in the manifesto, one of the things that Marx demands at the end is like that there should be universal and free education. So it's really no surprise that Fidel and the like newly formed government would take over the schools, but they did, and people were not super pleased about that, especially because the schools that they were taking over were like largely private and Catholic schools. Does that sound right, Dean?
Yeah, that's right.
So when the revolutionary government takes over the schools, that's kind of where the conflict begins between the government and the church. And it's kind of interesting. So, I mean, it's like the church doesn't like when it's kind of questioned in terms of its property or power or status in in any kind of given region, and this is definitely something that would upset them. So to give you a little bit of a hint and kind of window into why the churches were mad about the seizing of the schools, Fidel explains it like this. He says, religion in Cuba was disseminated, propagated, mainly through private schools, that is, schools run by religious orders. The schools I mentioned yesterday, so that's when he was talking about his childhood, which were attended by children of the wealthiest families in the country, the members of the old aristocracy, or those who considered themselves aristocrats, the children of the upper middle class, and the part of the middle class in general. So the problem was like that was the schools were sort of like not only like the center of like religious power, but also of economic power. There's lots of hegemony kind of radiating out from those schools. There were also not just Catholic schools, there were also Protestant schools. I think there were even some like secular private schools as well.
Yeah.
But they were all appropriated by the revolutionary government. And basically what Fidel goes on to say is that they didn't seize them because they were religious. They seized them because they were like centers and hotbeds for reactionary thought after the revolution.
Right.
So Fidel explains it along the lines of like, it's not that they were like Christians that was the problem. The problem was that they were reactionaries. And that was the real rub there. I find that pretty interesting, again, because it kind of speaks against that narrative that's often pushed of like a staunchly atheist communist party, which, I mean, it is true that they are atheists, but they're atheists not for like the theological reasons that people care about, but because of political reasons.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's also really interesting because you can just imagine Fidel, the day before he was basically talking about how when he was a kid, all of his teachers were Francoists, like they were supporting a Catholic fascist regime. So you can just imagine how that would feed into thinking about what you would do about Catholic education after the revolution. Like you just can't expect Francoists to be able to freely educate Francoism in a revolutionary situation. So I think that's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, it's also one that actually makes sense if you think about it. Like in even in like the liberal like United States, I mean, like we see this type of repression play out all the time. Like people are like censured and fired and like let go for teaching this sort of wrong ideology. I don't know. It shouldn't be surprising that it also happens other places. Yeah,
I think that's right. It's not surprising that the state wants to, I guess, protect its interests. It's just that some of the states are better than others.
Yeah, even to prove this whole bit about schools in general and sort of Fidel's take on religion here. This is, again, from the book, kind of taking another good quote from Fidel. He says, it wasn't just the Catholic and Protestant schools. All schools were nationalized, so they weren't targeting religions. They were just targeting schools.
Right.
So then he goes on to say, though, that I'm not saying, stating, or suggesting that private schools must necessarily be nationalized if the families that send their children to those schools have no antagonism toward the revolution. But if schools have become hotbeds of counter-revolutionary activity, especially when those activities become violent and linked to sabotage bombs and other CIA activities, with the CIA moving around everywhere, then they're problems. It's even more interesting too, because he goes on to say that the socialist state could even have schools that charged fees if this were deemed advisable, as long as there were enough free schools for the rest of the children and the free ones weren't worse than the others. So There's actually like a really interesting nuance here about education in like a Marxist-Leninist state, and also religious education too, that like private school isn't even necessarily in opposition as long as it's not bad.
Right. Yeah, I think it's just, it helps to read Fidel's actual thoughts on this because it's just more complicated than someone being like, you can just imagine someone kind of repeating a line about, well, Cuba took away like the schools, the Catholic schools there. And it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, like, why should he not have, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the whole reason that, I mean, that's how Marxism works. That's why Marxists like seize the government and like seize the state, and the anarchists don't, because like they think that you need to seize the state so you have the right apparatuses to protect the revolution, and this is exactly just that playing out.
Yeah, that's right. So I want to go on to talk about what Fidel thinks about religion in general in a minute, but before that, I just want to go back to how Fidel explains the opposition between leftist people and thinkers and religion in general. He has a really cool quote later in the book where he says, this is like kind of a paragraphy passage, but it's good, so I'm going to read it. He says, analyzing it from a historical perspective, nobody can deny that the church was on the side of the conquerors, oppressors, and exploiters, historically. It never categorically denounced slavery, an institution that is so repugnant to our consciences now. There was never a denunciation condemning the slavery of Africans or indigenous people. The church never denounced the extermination of the Aboriginal population or any of the other crimes that were committed against those people. The fact that they were robbed of their land, wealth, culture, and even their lives. None of the churches denounced those crimes, and the system lasted for centuries. No wonder the revolutionary ideas that emerged in the struggle against those age-old injustices had an anti-religious spirit. I think that's just a very good way of summarizing why you would not like religion if you were fighting against injustices, especially before the 20th century.
Right. I mean, that reminds me exactly of that episode we did about Herbert McCabe and
yeah.
I mean, what he says too, right? Like Christians are all about talking about nonviolence and resistance to injustice, but they'll never talk about the resistance like to injustice or like against capitalism, right? They'll never actually realize the sort of systemic things going on there that like Christians just sort of okay with.
And not only okay with, but in many cases, like bulwark. Like in a lot of like colonialism and slavery, that was done for Christian reasons by Christian people. I mean, there were exceptions. There were Christians who opposed it, but like by and large, it was Christians who built and maintained those brutal structures of oppression. So it makes sense why someone would feel the need to struggle against religious institutions and even belief, I guess.
Okay, so on that point, that like sort of dislike that revolutionaries, especially in Cuba, had for religion comes out in a, I guess, materialized way. There's a kind of, I don't know exactly how to read it, but kind of a funny interchange between Frei Betto and Fidel Castro. Frei Betto says at one point, I guess he just asked the question, is it true that Christians aren't allowed to belong to the Cuban Communist Party? And then Castro says, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, you said a bit ago that like that was changed after this book, and that is very cool, in fact. But you can't deny that they were not allowed, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that's interesting. Again, though, just like with the same logic we see, with the conversation about schools. Again, Christians weren't not accepted into the Communist Party because they were Christians, because they believed in Jesus Christ, because they took Eucharist. They weren't like excluded for any of those reasons. Again, they were excluded because most Christians in the country were also reactionaries. That's why. Not their religious power, but their political power was the problem.
Yeah, and he does say that like he recognizes that there were Christians fighting in the revolution against Batista, and he's like, we just didn't really care at that point because we had other things to worry about. But he goes on to say, I'm not saying that like Catholics can't be revolutionaries. They just can't be part of our party. That's it. And I think that's also a pretty interesting qualification. Like, he doesn't have anything against Catholics in Cuba being there and being, supportive of the communist regime or whatever. It's just that that's, I don't know. That's a complicated issue. Also, after this book came out and the party changed its stance, many of the members of the Communist Party said that they were Catholics, or they were Christians anyway, and they just hadn't said so when they were members. So that's a kind of funny anecdote, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the thing from Lenin playing out all over again. Like, I don't know, they don't really care what you believe. It's just about, like, can you get down? Can you get down with this?
Right.
This good revolution?
Right.
Fidel even goes on to say this rule was established as a result of the circumstances, not, again, for like ideological reasons. If you were to ask me, does this have to be so? I'd say no, it doesn't. And guess what?
Yeah.
It wasn't. So there you go. All right, so that's all pretty interesting stuff. There's I definitely, when I was reading this, got way down in like the sort of interesting minutia of the inner workings of like the electoral system in Cuba, because there is one. Because I guess I'm a nerd about that kind of stuff. But Dean, instead of talking about that, will you please transition us with one of your world-renowned transitions into some of the comments that Fidel makes about theology or liberation theology in general?
Yeah, here it comes. So if this is your first time listening to this podcast, you're in for a treat, because the reason I'm a master at segues is I just refuse to let them have power over me. We're the ones in the driver's seat here, and now this is what we're talking about: liberation theology. Now we're here. Look, it was so easy. We got.
That was
you
a
just
transition.
have to have the confidence. Yeah, we're seizing the means of transitioning here. So Fidel followed liberation theology as it developed in Latin America, which is really fascinating. He mentions at one point to Frei Betto that he owns all the books by Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez, which is pretty cool. And then he also says that he thinks liberation theology is basically, in his opinion, Christianity finding its roots again, finding its originary impulses. And he has a lot to say in this book about early Christians in Rome and how he just thinks that they're very cool, and there's a lot sort of symbolically in common between early Christians and, in his case, contemporary communists. But I think what I just found so fascinating was that he clearly has a lot of sympathies for liberation theologians around the continent, and sees it as an exciting movement, rather than as an accidental thing or just like a curiosity. One quote that I guess just really stuck with me is when Fidel says, "Liberation theology is so important that it forces all the Latin American left to take notice of it as one of the most important events of our time. We can describe it as such because it can deprive the exploiters, the conquistadors, the oppressors, the interventionists, the plunderers of our people, and those who keep us in ignorance, illness, and poverty of the most important tool they have for confusing, deceiving, and alienating the masses and continuing to exploit them." And I just thought that was such a cool way of putting it. Like, one reason that liberation theology is so important is that it does take away religion as a weapon to be used by the ruling class, and it uses it in the service of liberation.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. That really appeals to me. Obviously, of course, I think it's cool. I guess on that a similar point, a little bit earlier in the book, Fidel, I guess, signals towards, I guess, not that there's a strong relationship between leftist Christians and the Cuban Communist Party at this time, but he does gesture toward that there could be. So Fidel goes on to say, I guess he says earlier, "I've said that we, meaning Christians and communists, should do something more than coexist in peace. There ought to be closer, better relations. There should even be cooperation between the revolution and the churches, because they can't represent the landowners, the bourgeois, the rich anymore. I could be self-critical in this regard, and so could the churches, for not having worked in this direction during the past years, but contenting ourselves with coexistence and mutual respect." Again, this is kind of interesting because liberation theology seems like that bridge for Fidel. Like, that's how he's really still kind of connecting with those religious constituents amongst the folks who live in Cuba, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. It's also worth noting that Fidel went to Chile and other places too, but importantly went to Chile when a group of priests that were organized under the banner Christians for Socialism were trying to figure out how Christians could support the socialist government there. And Fidel spoke there, they invited him to give a talk, and I think that's something that's really fascinating. Fidel is such a symbolically important and weighted figure, and for him to be invited to a group like that and then to want to go there and try to say something about Christianity, I think is just a really fascinating moment. I mean, he's lending a lot of credence to a movement like Christians for Socialism, for example, and I think, there are people that would surely see that as a cynical ploy, he just wants religious people to kind of go along with the regime or whatever, but it's not that way. I mean, you can read his comments here. He's so much more thoughtful than that. I mean, he sees in Christianity something genuinely good and genuinely compatible with revolutionary communist governments, and he's trying very hard intentionally to build that up, and I think that is something that shouldn't be undersold.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the entire book is this, and it's on that exact same point. Fidel says, "Why should we make it easy for them, the bourgeoisie, to use the religious beliefs of a worker, a farmer, or a poor person against the revolution? It's politically wrong to do that. It's not just a question of political tactics. I feel that every citizen's right to their own beliefs should be respected, along with their rights to health, life, and freedom, and all the other rights. That is, I believe that the individual has the inalienable right to have or not have their own philosophical ideas and religious beliefs." So it's interesting. So it is actually a pretty nuanced point. It's on one hand a very tactical question, you don't want. I mean, Catholicism and Christianity in general was a reactionary force, and like you don't want to do that to your people. Like you don't want Christianity to be like reactionary force that sort of like poisons your people against the government, and like that's not great. But even more, he thinks that like people should just like, I don't know, have the ability to believe like whatever they want to believe. Again, exactly what Lenin said, but the USSR didn't really do.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's probably also owing, at least in part, to the fact that Fidel was clearly more interested in religion as a cultural force than somebody like Lenin. And, there's probably a very interesting paper to be written or to be read, if it already exists, sort of comparing their biographies and thoughts on the subject. But I guess that's one thing I just find so attractive about Fidel right now, at least in my life, is that he just seems to really have a genuine piqued curiosity about Christianity. I remember there's this quote in the book where he says, personally, what most inspired my respect for you, Frei Betto, who's a Dominican priest, by the way, again, to remind you, was my perception of your deep conviction and religious belief. I'm sure that the other people of the church who have concerned themselves with these problems are just like you. If we revolutionaries thought you weren't honest, nothing we've said would make any sense. Neither the ideas discussed nor the idea of an alliance or even unity, as I already said in Nicaragua, between Christians and Marxists. Because a true Marxist wouldn't trust a false Christian, and a true Christian wouldn't trust a false Marxist. Only this conviction can be the basis of a solid, lasting relationship. That reminded me a lot about what Dave, the provincial leader of the Communist Party of Canada, said a little while back as well, having been to Nicaragua and visited base communities. Like he was saying, you know, when we were sitting around in a room, like talking about real material problems, you were just in a room of other people working on these real material problems. Like you just trusted that you could all kind of come together and solve them. And that seems to be what Fidel's after here as well.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right, so there's a bunch of really cool stuff, I think, that Fidel says about how they shouldn't worry about Christians, and that's important. But I thought another really interesting part of this book is kind of uncovering Fidel Castro's own latent theology. Like, sometimes Frei Betto has to help him understand what he's saying. Like, he'll be like, oh, you're saying something that St. Ambrose said. And Fidel will be like, oh, well, that's cool. I'm glad that he said that. You should be proud of that. What did you make of that, Matt? Like, there's a moment where he talks about, like, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes as a symbolic parable. He talks about that weird wage parable that you mentioned several episodes ago. He talks about the Sermon on the Mount. What did you think about Fidel's theology as he was like slowly putting it together here?
Yeah, I mean, it is clear that Fidel has a theology, and it's good. It's just interesting to see him sort of translate the sort of like communist formulas into religious language. I guess it's interesting because like it is clearly there in the gospel. Like so many of those like good communist impulses are there. And it's interesting to see Fidel kind of unpack them in a really like material way in terms of political economy and like the distribution of, you know, like of property and that kind of stuff. It's a good okay, I don't know exactly what to say about it for Fidel. Like, I mean, like, it's good that he thinks those things. I think that it's more valuable, though, to other Christians because it reveals a little bit of a way that we can reappropriate the symbols of, like, Christian community in the gospel. Like,
yeah.
It's cool because, like, we don't, like, I don't know, especially having, like, gone to, like, a school and teaching at a school that like prizes its Christian education, and like, you know, I've like had to do lots of work in doing like exegesis and stuff like that. Like I've had to write exegesis papers and like think about like what the real meaning of this text is and stuff. It's cool just to see someone come along that has like actually no idea and then make a comment on it, and then you go, oh yeah, that's actually a really good point. Why didn't I ever just read it that way?
That's right.
So it's a cool way to reread those texts and think about them in a pretty drastically different way. Reappropriate those symbols to mean something that's radical again.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to just see what parables kind of stick out to Fidel. Like, there's the one about multiplying fishes and loaves, and he says, "Yeah, that's exactly what we wanted to do with the revolution in socialism: multiply fishes and loaves. That's what we're trying to do." And he goes on to mention that parable where Jesus talks about this guy who like gives the same wage to 3 different workers who all worked different amounts of time. And it's like, it seems unfair if you're a capitalist, I guess. But the best part is, I think Fidel rightly says that the reason that Jesus told it was because people probably didn't agree with it. Like, they thought that was weird, that you should just distribute wages. And it's cool, too, that he says, I believe that it is precisely a communist formula. That's what he says in the book. It goes beyond what we say in socialism, because in socialism, each should be paid according to his capacity and work, while the communist formula is to give to each according to his needs. And I just appreciate that he's like, well, Jesus actually goes a little bit further than the Cuban Revolution, actually.
Yeah. That is pretty interesting. Also, I mean, when I made that joke a few weeks ago about this exact same parable, I had not read this, so I like that, and in this case, at least, sort of on the same wavelength here.
Yeah, that's right.
As Fidel. That's cool.
There's another really cool moment in here where Fidel says, he's talking about, like, wealth, and he says, a rich man could never give back 4 times what he'd stolen, because everything a rich man has must have been stolen. If he didn't steal it himself, it must have been stolen by his parents or grandparents, so it's impossible. If everything he has is stolen, for him to return fourfold what he's stolen, for he'd probably have to steal 4 times as much again to keep that promise. So what's great is right after Fidel says that, Frei Betto says, you're repeating something that St. Ambrose said in the early centuries. And then Fidel says, I'm glad to have coincided with him. It's like, just like, oh, cool. That's neat. It's nice that we kind of came to that same conclusion. And that's also a kind of logic at work in Christianity that you see among Catholics and Protestants alike, that all your excess is actually stolen. It's not, not only is it not legitimately gained, it's like you stole it.
Right, that's the thing that we always talk about with the coats. If you got too many coats in your closet, you're stealing those coats.
Yeah.
Who said that? Who's that guy? Who's the coats guy?
John Chrysostom.
Oh,
I mean, other people say it differently, but that's one.
Yeah, but he's like the original coat commentator.
The coat guy.
He's
patron saint of coats.
Patron saint of coats. So a little bit later in the book, the conversation turns towards some ideas that Christians have a lot of opinions about. The idea of like loving your neighbor, and also the role that hatred plays. And it's a pretty interesting conversation between Betto and Castro. So Dean, can you kind of explain like what that conversation was about?
Yeah, it's cool because Frei Betto, I think, really throws this as like a soft pitch for Fidel to like knock it out of the park, and surprise he does. So Frei Betto is basically like, well, hatred's kind of a thing that Christians aren't very comfortable with, essentially. And Fidel responds by talking a lot about how hatred is actually very good if you understand it appropriately. So, for example, he says, Marxism-Leninism doesn't cause or preach class hatred. It simply says that classes and class struggle exist and that struggles give rise to hatred. It isn't Marxism-Leninism, but the existence of classes and class struggle that causes hatred. What really causes hatred? Human exploitation, oppression, marginalization, and social injustice. And I think that is really great. He goes on to say later on, I don't think there's any contradiction with Christian teachings, because if somebody says, I hate crime, or I hate injustice, abuses, and exploitation, I don't think that would be against Christian teachings. I don't think that denouncing and fighting against crime, injustice, exploitation, abuses, and inequalities among people goes against Christianity or is in contradiction with religion. And I think that's just like a cool way of putting it. Like, well, don't you actually kind of hate some things? And isn't it important to hate those things such that you can fight against them appropriately?
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it reminds me, like, the conversation about hatred reminds me of so many times, I guess, in like the Old Testament, where I don't know, the prophets are like yelling about whatever, and telling you to, you know, like love God, like love justice and righteousness, and like hate evil. Like that's like a actually very Christian idea, like that you hate that thing. Right. Oh, like here, this is what I was thinking of. I just looked it up. In like Amos, hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate. Perhaps the Lord God of hosts may be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. Okay, so the part about Joseph isn't important, but hate evil, love good. That's like some good Christian stuff right there. Some from the prophets. Okay, good. Man, that one commentator who said that we don't do exegesis on this show is gonna hate this episode. But it's good.
It's about time,
right? I mean, like sometimes like it is definitely the case that like especially like liberal Christians get like really bent out of shape about the idea of like hate. Like you're not supposed to hate everybody. Like Jesus is like this like really loving character, and that's totally true. But there are things that you should actually abhor.
Yeah. Actually, Frei Betto says that in response to Fidel. He says, Jesus made some very strong charges against the Pharisees and called Herod a fox. What's more, Jesus tells us we must love our enemies. He doesn't say we mustn't have enemies. And there's no greater love for an oppressor than to prevent him from oppressing another.
Yeah.
That's like straight from the Dominican priest's mouth.
Yeah, man. I'm pretty sure that's also like a throwback way back to like one of those Derek Ford episodes where he said exactly that same thing. Where Derek, I think he said exactly the same thing about like loving your neighbor. It means like stopping them from doing something that's going to be even more terrible.
Yeah, that's also, I think we talked about that in the context of the Herbert McCabe stuff, because McCabe says that in the Class Struggle and Christian Love essay, which, by the way, is very good. If you're still, like, working through the problems with, Christianity and class struggle and violence, like, that's the one to read. If you can only read one, that's the one.
Yeah, for real. So, overall, this book is, like, historically important. As we mentioned, I think several times throughout this episode, that there's like a lot going on here that's like kind of a first. Like it's the first time a Dominican priest ever talked to like a Marxist-Leninist head of state, for sure. That's interesting. Anyways, so it's historically important conversation because it like builds that bridge between like world powers, between like the Soviet bloc and the more capitalist countries. However, like, I wonder what we can still say about the importance of this conversation. Like, if it's still more than just a historical conversation, if it's, like, something we can actually do something with. Because, like, the Soviet bloc is dissolved. Like, we don't need, like, these bridges between, like, the capitalists and the communists and so on, like, are less important than they maybe were at the height of the Cold War. So I wonder, like, what kind of role this book plays for us now. Like, how can we use it? How can this help us think through Christian leftism? I don't know. Is it still important as something more than just a historical book?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I like it a lot. I hope that it actually inspires people to maybe think it through and keep thinking with us about it, because I feel like there's probably a lot of things that I wouldn't even think in terms of like putting this book to use for now, I guess. I think one reason that I found it so exciting when I discovered it is that it's just like it's kind of comforting to know that there was a period in history and there still is a period ongoing. Like Frei Betto is still alive when Christians were trying really hard to think through what it would mean for them as Christians to contribute to leftist political movements in their own right. And I guess for me, like reading this whole book, it just serves as kind of an encouraging word and almost like a torch to keep carrying forward. Like, who's going to be the next Frei Betto? Like, he's getting old, so there's got to be some other cool Dominican priests and lay people out there, trying to find like I guess where they can get involved, who they can talk to about these kinds of things. Like where's the Frei Betto talking to the leader of the PSL, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems to be the use for me. Like, it's encouraging in that Frei Betto has provided a real example, and Fidel Castro has actually provided a very hospitable response, and that's something that we can kind of hope to keep cultivating.
Yeah, I think that's good. So in some future episodes of the Magnificast, we're going to talk a little bit more about this movement called Christians for Socialism. Well, just kind of, Dean, just like you, I mean, it's an encouraging word. There's this quote from Dorothy Soleil, who's a German liberation theologian and a part of this sort of movement at one point. And she says this about Christianity and socialism that I thought was kind of relevant to me because it kind of explained how I feel. So here we go. She says, most of the people I know in the movement, Christians for Socialism, feel themselves in the dilemma of being Christians without a church and socialists without a party. While we recognize that our displacement must be overcome, nonetheless, to be honest, the feeling of homelessness creeps in, paralyzing us and making us poor single fighters. I think that is, I mean, if you're a Christian leftist and you're listening to that, I bet you have felt that exact same way before.
For
sure. Homeless, a Christian without a church, a socialist without a party, single fighters. And I guess what this book does for me is helps me recognize that, like, that's not really true. And that there was a Christian left, and that there still is. So it's nice.
It is nice.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. Make sure that you follow us on Twitter, like us on iTunes. If you feel moved by the specter of communism or whatever, you can give us a little bit of money on Patreon and help support getting this show made. We'd really appreciate that. Okay, thanks for listening.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.